Welcome to another entry in the Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Reviews series. This is, as it sounds like, a series of video reviews where I give critical, unvarnished takes on a variety of works that are in philosophy in a general sense, so including self-help and ethics and musings about leadership or professional life and all sorts of other things in between. The book that we're going to be reviewing today is fairly recent, from 2024, by Lucian Samms, and it is called Bear And Forbear, Zen In the Art of Living, with the art of living in quotations. And it's essentially a book trying to bring together some things from Zen Buddhism and from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. So we're going to talk about a number of facets of it. I will say from the very beginning that I'm actually not going to recommend this book to you, but I'm not going to go as far as to give a negative or disrecommendation. And so, you'll find out why as we go through this essentially fairly critical review. I always like to begin with the three big S's, talking about the style of the work, providing some sort of summary of it, and also discussing the structure of the work. What is it that you're getting yourself into if you happen to purchase this book? So let's get style out of the way very quickly. It's readable. Samms is a good writer, so it's very clear in what's being said throughout the work. I think that's probably enough about style. The overall summary of the work, as Samms lays it out, is that this is supposed to be a book to get an American audience ultimately into living out a Zen Buddhist life, but through an intermediary. That might seem a little bit strange or surprising to some people, but other people have drawn parallels between Buddhism and this particular popular philosophical movement, and that is Stoicism. And so Samms is going to be trying to use Epictetus as kind of a gateway into Zen Buddhism, saying there's a lot of similarities between Stoicism and Zen Buddhism. And so by studying Epictetus, or at least the summaries of him in here, an American and perhaps even larger Western audience will be set up well for doing that. So that's essentially what the book is supposed to be about. What does the book look like? So it begins with a preface and an intro that are, written in a very, well argued and coherent sort of train of thought here. And then the bulk of the book is what he calls interpretive summaries of the discourses. So almost all of the book is going to be particular book and then chapter of Epictetus's discourses, his main work, provided to us by his student Arian, who wrote down these discourses. And what we get is anything from a sentence or two to almost an entire page for each one of these, beginning with Book 1, Chapter 1, going all the way to the end of Book 1, and finishing up with Book 4 and going to Chapter 13. After that, we get these Zen Stoic hymns, is what they're called. And there's 6 of those in here. The first 2 are on the longer side. One of them is only 1 sentence long, the hymn 4. My own mind is the absolute, everything perceiving, perceived, and changing, right? And then we get some references, and after that we get a selected bibliography. So we're really getting 2 different bibliographies. One of works that are actually mentioned, less explored than mentioned in this work, and then extra stuff that you might check out, right? So that's basically what you're getting in this work. I will also mention that Samms tells us that he left spaces between the chapters. So, what you see here is there's a lot of blank space on the page, a lot of pages that are blank space, and that's so you can write stuff in. And, you can read Epictetus's discourses yourself. You can think about the thoughts that it inspires and use this as kind of a journal, is what he has in mind. So that's enough about the 3 S's. All right, so what are the main points of the work? I will say that you're getting some of these in the preface and the introduction, and then you're supposed to carry those forward into the little summaries of the chapters of Epictetus's discourses. And I'll begin by saying that there's a number of ideas that are coming from Stoicism, and some in the preface and introduction coming from Zen Buddhism and other places as well, that Samms is going to present and then sometimes discuss and apply. So if you're not already familiar with them, then you can get some background in these ideas. It's in no sense a compendium or even summary of Stoic doctrine. There's a lot more ideas from Stoicism left out than included. And I will also mention that there's a claim made in the work, and this is in the main body of it. So this would be in the commentary or the thoughts on Book 2, Chapter 10, where he says, "We are Stoics, most of us, and do not know it, since we've inherited and often lived by folk sayings that reveal the art of living, including sayings from around the world that reveal the truth that finally choice is the only attribute that we have that's truly our own and in our own control." And he goes on from there. Okay, so there's a lot of people out there who say similar things in blog posts and videos, and even sometimes just in comments. I was a Stoic this whole time and didn't know it. And okay, that's certainly a take. I think that's something that is one of the main points that he wants to make. I will also mention another thing. This is coming up in the introduction. He's going to tell us that the goal here is figuring out, and providing something for how Americans and all Westerners can naturally practice Zen Buddhist living. And that is going to lead us to the, let's call it, what would be the right phrase? It's not even the key concept or the leitmotif running throughout a composition. It is the endlessly repeated drumbeat that is dinned into your ears of Bear and Forbear, right? This famous phrase that is supposed to have come from Epictetus. I would say just about every single chapter summary includes those terms in here, and there's a lot of discussion of it in the introduction as well. So he's certainly very consistent in presenting that main idea of bearing and forbearing. There's some discussion of it that's going on. For example, bearing and forbearing enable us nearly always to be firmly in control of our life, but only if these actions become habits which eventually we come to practice instinctively, right? A Stoic life invites us to be masters of pain through bearing and masters of pleasure through forbearing, to keep our equanimity and balance through a paradoxically selfless mastery of self. Ironically, where we cannot bear and forbear, we can dip into an even deeper reservoir of courage and confidence, having decided that some finally unknowable fundamental circumstance, in parentheses, Buddhist nirvana, lies outside our power to choose, that is to either bear pain or forbear pleasure. So you get a sense of what Bear and Forbear is about here. You will find it, as I mentioned, discussed, or at least referenced, at least repeated on every single page of the summaries in here. There's some other claims that I think probably should be mentioned in terms of key ideas. So one of them, of course, is that we can do some comparative work here, and Stoicism and Zen Buddhism actually have a lot in common, and we'll throw in another one that he mentions as well, the Indian, one particular school of philosophy, of traditional Orthodox Hindu philosophy, Vedanta, which is one of several important ones. And then he also brings up several other Western authors who he thinks there's some interesting connections with as well. And he also mentions Taoism and deism and pantheism and all of that. So there's an assertion here, a superstructure of reality shared by many Eastern and Western thinkers is that all phenomena in and of the universe which we perceive is an infinite, eternal, yet transient multiplicity of physical energy forms possessing various degrees of conscious awareness. And now we're going to get to another key doctrine that's being clearly endorsed here, are simply interconnected manifestations of a single body mind, a single being, a single self, variously described as big mind by Suzuki, the unborn self of Zen master Bankei, the void, unfolded emptiness, and the empty mirror, and Einstein's quantum reality of uncertainty and balance, M equals E, divided by c squared, more popularly rendered as E equals mc squared. So lots of, these are all dealing with the same thing. And notice that there's an endorsement here of one particular understanding of reality. In Buddhist circles, this is sometimes associated with the Yogacara, or consciousness only school, which certainly plays a role in, as so many other schools do, in Zen, but is a take. It's not the single Buddhist take, and it's not even the single Stoic take, frankly. Stoics do believe that, yes, we are all part of one big cosmos, at least the traditional Stoics, and that cosmos is inhabited by a divine logos. It's intentional, it's rational, it's living, it exercises providential care for us, and yet we also exist. And we're not just moments of this grand mind or anything like that. We're identified to identify our purposes and align our will with that of this, in effect, God, but it doesn't mean that we're God or that we're consciousness itself or anything like that, right? So there's some definite takes being staked out here in the work. There's also an interesting claim that I'll mention for those of you who are into Stoic philosophy, that Stoic logic and ethics actually arise from the Stoic physics and cosmology. Now that, again, that's a take, and definitely not one that all modern Stoics would agree with, but not even one that all classic Stoics would agree with. So there's some, positions being staked out here as main points that could be a bit controversial. I think that's enough about the main points. As I mentioned, Bear and Forbear is going to get hammered into you on just about every single page throughout this work. What's good about this text? So, I can say that it's got some nice cover art, and it's very nicely laid out. Its design features are decent. I do like the fact that the author makes it clear where he's coming from. That's better than just, throwing this stuff at you. The references and bibliography are, representative, not bad. Certainly you could learn something reading quite a few of these works, even the ones that don't seem particularly relevant to what's going on here. If you did read some of these works, you might say, well, I don't know how aligned this work is with those works. For example, Lawrence Becker's A New Stoicism, a notoriously difficult book that I've led students through, and it's takes quite a while to get through. So you can actually learn. If you didn't know anything about Stoicism, I guess you could learn some things about Stoicism by looking at the chapter summaries in this or reading the introduction. It's doing some interesting comparative work. I like the fact that the author's not trying to make the clearly ahistorical claim that somehow Stoicism is Western Buddhism, which we know is not the case. But that there are some interesting parallels that could be drawn on certain points between the Western philosophy and the vast world of many schools of Buddhism practiced by, literally millions of people throughout time. So, that's not bad at all. I think that this could be interesting for some readers to see what somebody else's take on these matters could be and happens to be. And, it's nice that he left you some room to write your own thoughts. You could use this, I suppose, as a journal, which is what he is suggesting you do to engage the work. And he is also saying, too, which I think is good, that, here we go, this is on the part interpretive summaries of the discourses. The following interpretive summaries will help to reveal the practical ways the Stoic art of living can help Westerners realize a Zen Buddhist life. I recommend readers examine closely each chapter of the discourses as companion pieces to the interpretations below. So he's not saying, hey, I've given you the real nutshell of it. He's saying read the discourses. And that could be good or bad for the book, depending on what comes out of your reading of it. So those are some, I would say, good points of the book. And we'll just leave that there. So unfortunately, there are a lot of what I certainly consider to be problematic aspects of this book. And I say that not only as somebody who's arguably an expert in Stoic philosophy, but also as somebody who's had an interest in and has actually taught a lot of Buddhist texts from a variety of different schools, an interest that goes all the way back to my teenage years and has continued on through to the present, coming from a family, by the way, that includes Buddhists, but not Zen Buddhists, rather the much more common and popular and devotional Pure Land Buddhism, which is not mentioned at all in this text. So I'm going to begin with the very title and the central idea, Bear and Forbear, or in its much more common formulation, endure and renounce. So is this a Stoic idea? It's Stoic-y, but it's coming from a text which should give us some pause. If you go through Epictetus's works, the Discourses in the Enchiridion, looking for the phrase, whether you search it in the Greek or in English translation, you will not find that until you get to the fragments. And the fragments are things that are not actually said by Epictetus in the Discourses or the Enchiridion, but attributed to him in other works. And sometimes we can be very confident that, yeah, he probably did say that, but this one isn't that case. This is coming from another author, Arrius Gellius's Attic Nights, and this is hearsay, essentially. He has an attribution of this coming from the other philosopher, Favorinus, who actually writes a book against Epictetus, who says that Epictetus was in the habit of saying this all the time. Is this like a real testimony? We don't know. We certainly shouldn't place an awful lot of reliance on it, let alone make it the centerpiece of our interpretation of Epictetus. So that's a bit of a problem. There's zero mention of where that phrase actually came from. There's zero engagement with the context of it. And that tells me that probably Samms isn't aware of this as being not a spurious quote, but one that we shouldn't place an awful lot of reliance on. If you were going to come up with like the one single quote by Epictetus that we should center things around, a more plausible contender, but also one that would be problematic as well, would be the so-called dichotomy of control. Some things are in our control, some things are not. Here's what's in our control, here's not. You can't just go to one single part, for example, Enchiridion 1 or Discourses 1:1, and get the entire list of what's in our control and what's not, because it's a complex idea that is developed organically throughout Epictetus's works. Bear and Forbear, or endure and renounce, not quite that status. So it's sort of a problematic interpretive choice for Epictetus. Even if it was just Epictetus, it's definitely a problematic choice when it comes to Stoicism, because Epictetus is one of several main Stoic authors who we have. And, does this adequately summarize Cicero's discussions of Stoicism? No. Does it adequately summarize Musonius Rufus's? No. Does it adequately summarize Seneca, the person who we actually have the most literature from? Not at all. Not even Marcus. So that's, I think, a big red flag for the work. There's also things where you're like, yeah, I don't really know about this. The references to Epictetus, other than where we have, the chapter and the book being given, are all to one particular translation of Epictetus, which is, edited by Christopher Gill, translation by Robin Hard. There's zero discussion of other possible translations, and then, it's just a page number. So you'd actually have to go to the that particular edition, which is a little bit weird, right? There's a lot of chapter blurbs that I would say are not connected very well to Epictetus's own topics in those very chapters. There, you read through it and you look at the list of the discourses, and you're like, okay, so this should talk about this topic because that's the topic that the chapter title is about. And you're like, well, that's not actually being talked about here. What will be talked about is Bear and Forbear. Right? So that's going to come up a lot. I'll give you some examples. So here's one in the very beginning of Book 2. There's some discussions about how we can bring together confidence and courage with caution and care. And that's a topic that is being discussed in 2.1. Is it really adequately discussed in here? I would say no. And then we also, that's going to come up later in Book 2 as well. And it's not being discussed there much at all, right? So, it's kind of playing fast and loose with things there. Another example in 2.6 is, talking about courage and confidence. And I'll just give you one other as well. So there's a discussion about preconceptions. Now that's a term, also general conceptions, prolepses in Epictetus. Massive topic, probably as important as the dichotomy of control. Little bit of discussion of it. We often differ on our preconceptions of what is good, right, how they should be applied to our experiences. So we have to develop rules of action. Asking the right questions with the aid of a single interlocutor is the best way of establishing the rules. Not what Epictetus says. Not remotely what Epictetus says. He doesn't say a single interlocutor. Yes, we do this in part through discourse. He says Plato was doing that. And these preconceptions, they apply to all sorts of things, including what's in our control and what's not in our control. You wouldn't possibly get any idea of that from this text. So I think that's kind of problematic. There's also, this weird assertion that, the Stoics talked about logic, physics, and ethics as being the parts of philosophy, right? Here, he's going to call them the foundations of Stoicism. That's why. Why would you change the term to something that makes less sense? They're not the foundations of Stoicism. They are what the Stoics called the body of the actual work. And Seneca has letters about this that you can go to. Epictetus has discussions about this sort of thing. The Stoic doxographies in Arius Didymus and Cicero and Diogenes Laertes are very clear about this. So that's kind of a weird reconfiguration that I think is likely to mislead people. There's also a lot of weird references to other authors where you're like, this kind of doesn't belong here. I wonder why he's going off on these tangents. Great example of this is Hayek gets mentioned twice, right? So in 123, we learn this reliance on a maximum of liberty is echoed in F.A. Hayek's description of the crucial importance of natural and personal freedom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What the hell's that doing in there? Is that actually relevant to Epictetus? Certainly doesn't seem so to me as somebody who knows both authors. And he brings up this again in Hayek's central point in his great work, The Constitution of Liberty, concerning freedom under the law. Not really Stoic there. He also brings up Rousseau at certain points, the profession of a Savoyard vicar, Spinoza, who's kind of a go-to point, but Spinoza is actually very different than the Stoics on a number of important points, and very different than Buddhism. And then he brings up, as just a quip, which leads me to believe that he hasn't actually read the text, because this quote comes near the end of the famous book. He says, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Well, that has to be unpacked, right? Why must we imagine Sisyphus unhappy? Camus provides a reason and an argument for that in the myth of Sisyphus. Nothing like that here. It's just a quote. And it's not doing much work, I would say. He also mentions a few other people along the way, but we don't have to go through that. So there's some extraneous name dropping going on, I would say. The bibliography, I would say, is a bit, let's call it, stuffed. I mentioned bringing up Lawrence Becker. If Lawrence Becker were to read this, he'd be like, this person didn't get Stoicism right. So it's weird to bring up somebody as a source you should read who probably would not appreciate your work. There's a lot of cool Zen literature being talked about here. And then some stuff that has to do with other broader conceptions of Buddhism. There's some things that have to do with Hindu philosophy, like the Bhagavad Gita. There's also the complete works of, Chuangzi. There's the Tao Te Ching. But these things are, weirdly enough, referenced in the old style of writing about them. So you get the sense that the person writing this might call it Taoism rather than Taoism because they don't have a lot of connection to it. I think that you could read the works coming from Zen Buddhism productively in this, and it wouldn't hurt you. But some of the other stuff is a little bit weird. Referencing all these philosophers and their anglicized names, but then making Heraclitus Herakleitos, Well, that's a little pretentious, isn't it? Or maybe they're not quite sure how it works. So, the bibliography is a little bit weird. There's also a lot of odd translations that are being used that I would say can be a bit misleading. For example, the word choice, which comes up a lot in here. Clearly, in the context that it's being applied, it's supposed to translate proairesis, an absolutely central concept for Epictetus throughout the discourses, throughout the Enchiridion, something that's unique to Epictetus as opposed to the other Stoics, but we don't translate it as choice. We translate it typically as faculty of choice because it's not just making a choice, it's the faculty of choice. And we sometimes translate it as moral purpose or even as will. So if you were reading this as somebody who doesn't know much about Stoicism, you're going to get some mistaken ideas about things. Similarly, bringing up the word naturally, the Stoics talk about in accordance with nature, right? Kataphusin, and they use a lot of other similar language, like that of being in harmony, being, in other words, in accordance with it. There's like a whole terminology or vocabulary that's used for that. None of that's reflected in the term naturally. That requires some real clarification. That's a place where people studying Stoicism get tripped up all the time. We're like, yeah, when we're talking about in accordance with nature, we mean like fully developed human nature, not just like humans as a bunch of dirty animals who do bad stuff, right? We're not just talking about the natural cosmos. So, the translation choices here, I would say, risk misleading the reader. I'm not really sold on the rather controversial interpretation of consciousness only, and that being central to, Eastern and Western thinkers and all of this sort of stuff. Yeah, I don't really buy that. I'm also a bit disappointed that, there's a deliberate, or maybe not deliberate, decision to only talk about the most wax-nosed Buddhist school, meaning you can turn it any way you want to, and that's Zen or Chan Buddhism, depending on whether you're using the Japanese or Chinese term for it, rather than all the other important schools of Buddhism that people actually practice, right? Including the most popular one of the Mahayana schools, the Pure Land School, which often, has connections with Zen or Chan Buddhism. I don't see any discussion of that here. So I'm always a little bit suspicious of people who talk lots and lots about Zen, but not about other schools of Buddhism. Makes me always a little bit on edge, and it probably should put you a little bit on edge as well. The other thing that I'll mention here, because I don't want to go on too much about this, is this one section, 3:12, where he claims there's 3 steps to being a Stoic, right? Use logic and reason to learn to examine impressions of life in order to determine what's in our power and what's not in our power. 2, strive to only take good actions by forbearing pleasures and bearing pains. Habituate our practice of equanimity by using our thoughts, words, and deeds to balance extremes through restraint to move beyond good and evil. Sounds rather Nietzschean there. To mirror the indifference of the God of nature, right? Now, is that the 3 steps to being a Stoic? Hell no. That is not remotely what we would actually get out of Epictetus or Seneca or any of the people who actually do talk about 3s as being quite important. But they're usually talking about like 3 disciplines, aren't they? You know? And that's not in here at all. So I think this is probably, if you were going to try to study Stoicism and you didn't know much about it, this is not going to be the book to go to. If you know a lot about Stoicism, you will find this book frustrating for a variety of reasons. So that's enough said, I think. All right, final thoughts about this. So I'm not going to disrecommend this. I'm not going to say, God, don't get this book. You know, if somebody gives it to you, don't even bother opening it up, as I have with some books in the past, but I'm also not going to recommend it. So it's somewhere in between. Hey, if you want to get this book and check it out, go on ahead. I don't think it's going to be a particularly useful book, and you probably could spend your time and money and thought in more productive ways than engaging with this. I would have liked to have been able to give a more positive review of it, because I think that the topic as an idea is quite a good one, right? But I think the assumptions built into it, the choice to focus on kind of a sketchy foundation for the entire work as its main motif, and the perhaps not sufficient engagement with classic Stoic thought end up making it a bit of a problematic work that could have been developed further in different ways. I would say there's still plenty of room for people doing solid comparative work on Buddhism and Stoicism. I've talked about some of those works in the past, so that's probably enough for me to say about it. It's up to you if you want to go out and get this book. I've got a copy, but I'm not recommending this as a book to get your hands on.